Hi, this is Jeanette Neiden, and I'm with my co-author for the Contract Professionals Playbook, Lawrence. Lawrence, can you introduce yourself?
Well, you kind of did. I'm Lawrence, but the reason you should listen to me or be engaged in this conversation with us is I've been doing this for a little over 20 years. I have a lot of experience, helped create many of the industry's leading practices, and that wound it up with well, that's great grammar. That eventually led to my being inducted in the SIG Sourcing Supernova Hall of Fame, which is recognition by peers that I actually am worth talking to. So there you go.
Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by banded pricing?
Yeah, so typically if I have a service and there's some underpinning cost structure to that service, I want to get credit for economies of scale as things go up, and I don't want to get hurt on the way down. So there used to be this thing called arc rec pricing way back in ancient history in kind of the one size fits all outsourcing deals. Most contracts don't have that anymore. But what that did is it protected the supplier on the way down and kind of made pricing variable on the way up. I don't like that. But what I do like is, let's say we'll use the example of a service desk, and I've got, maybe bands every 100,000 calls per month from 100,000 up to 1,000,000. If my baseline is 100,000, maybe that costs, $10 a call. When I get to 200,000, instead of doubling to 20, maybe it actually is 15. And then it goes to 17 and it goes to 19 and whatever, right? So the idea is there's an economy of scale that the supplier has in their cost structure. In a service desk, that means, there's a bunch of overhead, there's the switches, there's the VRUs, there's all this IT stuff. That's a fixed cost. It doesn't change much based on the volumes. And then you got people that you need to bring in and out, based on how many calls you have to do, or whether it's chat or, whatever the thing is. So theoretically, as the calls go up in volume, the cost doesn't go up proportionally. It goes up at a slower rate. I want to see that difference in the pricing, and the same thing when it goes back down. And so the having of banded pricing means theoretically, if you buy more stuff, you pay less on a per unit basis, roughly, right? And there's a billion perturbations to that, but that's the general concept.
What about, though, when you get to an inflection point, when you increase volume, and you suddenly now have to increase capital? So this is what I'm thinking about is, as I mentioned in the last video, for one of my clients, I was on technical support like crazy, 45-minute waits, and the wait times have come down. But it's because I think they're getting smarter at answering the calls. There's probably fewer calls now as people have figured out technical issues, but there's also this incredible increase in bandwidth and the number of users and all kinds of things. What happens when the next wave hits and there's a significant increase in demand, where we get to the inflection point where we now have to invest in capital and bandwidth and other sorts of things, where it's not this nice lockstep, and we suddenly have an infusion of capital to make that happen? What are your thoughts on how to bake that into an agreement?
Yeah, that's something that really depends on the scale, right? So if you look at, cloud, AWS or Google or whatever is your, the scale there, the capital is probably already baked in, right? And you're not going to see a step because they're so big. Other than that, in most sort of normal, air quotes normal, like you're talking about the call center, maybe they need to open another location. Maybe they need to buy more network circuits. Maybe they need to buy, whatever it is. So when you get to that kind of thing, the supplier, you still have the same bands. It's just that instead of having this decreasing, directly as volumes go up, price goes down, it'll be a stair step. So it'll go, that's part of the thing for the band, right? So maybe in the first band, all the sunk costs are there. In the second band, all the capital. The third band, there's new capital, right? So that's where, if you're really savvy and understand how the supplier's cost structure works for whatever the service is, you can actually bake that in kind of yourself and let them fill in pricing goes associated with it. If you aren't, ask those questions and say, hey, what bands would make sense, right? Because what we don't want to do is have, you know, on the buy side, we don't want to lose economies of scale and get the value of it. On the sell side, we don't want to get stuck with, you know, if it's 1,001, all of a
Right.
sudden my cost doubles and I don't get covered for that, right? So that's why working together through the RFP process and negotiation, you can set those bands at the right point where if there is that inflection of I have to buy much more equipment or I have to make some other big investment, that's covered in the step. The thing that's not covered in the step that you need to figure out, and it's kind of a best guesstimate based on past, is what am I going to do with automation? What am I going to do with you know, processes improvements or knowledge management or other things that are going to break that step? In other words, eventually I get better at this, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, just a simple thing with a call center. If my call center has to be people who speak really, really good American, then it's going to be probably somebody in America or maybe a few other countries, not very many that speak great unaccented American English, right? As opposed to real English. I was just talking to somebody from England this morning. So I would be told, I was told, you don't speak English, you speak American. The point is, if you're going to use chat, there are tons of places where people can type English. It's their second language. But when you type, accents don't matter. You can understand them. So if you can move more and more context to chat, you have to have less people that maybe you had to pay at a higher rate. You might be able to use bots and other automation to answer some things and then kick it over to a human where it matters. So you can start to break that price curve, right? Because it's cheaper as you start peeling things off of the expensive and time consuming, I'm talking to you in real life over the phone or video, and kick it off to automation, like automated password resets, things like that, or bots or chat or areas where all of a sudden the requirements are a little bit different. Does that make sense?
So, yes, it does, but I'm going to put an asterisk there because you and I both have done this kind of work in contracts before. So I'm thinking about my audience, and this is going to be a new concept. There are a few CPOs I've come across over the years that can have a conversation with us at this level, but that's not who our clientele is for the playbook. So let's get this down to the newer contracting professional, new to the profession, not necessarily young, and subject matter experts who may come across our material. In terms of banded pricing, what are some tips that you might give someone who's new to this concept? I do not envision our clients for the playbook being the one to come up with the idea of doing banded pricing, but they may be tasked with trying to develop the language around it.
Sure. So always ask experts, right? So if I want to understand, let's just stick with call center because we've been using that example. If I want to understand how a call center works, where I work, used to do that ourselves, and then we outsourced it. So there are still experts there who manage that account, who used to be, you know, the managers of the actual call center. So they understand what does it take, and you can build a should cost internally with those subject matter experts and some finance expertise, or if you're good at sheets, you can even do it yourself, which says, if I was to create this, I don't know what the supplier's cost is, but if I was to do it myself, what would it take? What all's in it? Plant, equipment, IT, people, you know, depreciation schedules, software licenses, all that stuff, right? What would it take to build this from scratch? And how do I know what the capacity is and where those inflection points are? Where I think those inflection points are, I'm going to bake the initial bands, and I'll let the suppliers, you know, propose something different if I'm not certain what those would be. I can also go, you know, do web searches. Any government contract is going to be public record, so you can see what those things are, you know, and the government buys a lot of stuff. You can talk to peers at other companies. You can get research from, you know, if we're talking call centers, Gartner, Forrester, ISG, Bureau, whatever, any of the folks who cover IT, right? So you can get a whole bunch of data going in, and then in the negotiation process, you work out the details with the supplier based on your unique needs, right? And so, for example, your costs in a call center, if you're talking is it just IT, or are you doing things like being the contact center for the sales function as well? So that scope would make a big difference, right?
Yeah.
And how you architect that, as long as the structure's set up, a good supplier is going to tell you in their bid and in negotiations how to make it reasonable. And if you have multiple bidders, they can't lie to you, right? Because you're going to see a whole bunch of different perspectives of what's appropriate, and that'll help let you narrow in on that sweet spot. But always have those subject matter experts, because we in procurement and contracting, maybe experts in procurement and contracting, we're not experts in IT. We're not experts in building a call center or staffing a call center or all those things, right? So whatever the service or product is we're buying, somebody in the company should know. And if those people don't, there's lots of consultants out there who would love to help. And they do this not just once every 4 or 5 years or however long your contract is. They do it 20 times a day or whatever, being slightly facetious. But that's how you can get the expertise, so that we can stick to our swim lane, which is how do we negotiate well, how do we do good solicitation, how do we make sure it's ethical and above board, how do we get the right protections in for both sides, blah, 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 and get that technical expertise around the product or service we're actually buying from somebody who really knows it well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Lawrence. I really appreciate that.
I can't believe we had this whole conversation about banded pricing. It was actually interesting. So
we do interest ourselves. Let's hope we also interest people who sign up for the newsletter. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, you too.